Hey everybody, Matt Johnston here. And in this video, we're going to be talking specifically about the interactive process when dealing with an employee who's making a request for an accommodation. This applies generally to any accommodation under the Americans with Disabilities Act, but we're specifically going to be looking at it in the context of COVID-19. In previous videos, I've talked about the fact that the Americans with Disabilities Act technically applies only to employers in the U.S. with 15 or more employees. But I also cautioned that employers with 14 or fewer employees may want to consider engaging in this interactive process when dealing with employees when they're returning to work, whenever they have concerns or worries about underlying medical conditions that could make them more susceptible to acquiring the COVID-19 virus. So while 14 or fewer employees is not strictly required by the law, engaging in this process makes things a little bit more open. So in the last video, I specifically talked about the importance of job descriptions when dealing with the issues of the interactive process and making accommodations. You need to understand not only what the job does, its job description, but also the job requirements. So any disability that affects the ability of an employee to work a particular job, you need to know what those job requirements are. So the interactive process usually starts with a request for an accommodation. The funny thing is the request doesn't actually say, hey, by the way, I need an accommodation for my ADA related disability. It's usually going to take the guise of, I'm immunocompromised, or I'm caring for somebody at home who is immunocompromised, something along those lines. They may come in with concerns about their overall health. And it's not a direct, straight up request. And so you have to, as an employer, listen to what is being talked about. Because the request for the accommodation is often going to be implicit. It's going to be couched in the phrase of, I'm concerned about X. And I'm concerned about my work here affecting X. So that's often how it's going to be approached. And so you got to sort of listen for it. You also, as an employer, need to look out for the possibility of accommodations being necessary. So let's take, for example, you have an employee who has taken time off for respiratory illness, okay, or for a cancer treatment, or they have taken time off to care for somebody of those kinds of categories of cancer patients or something like that. You may want to have a nice subtle conversation about how that is all going. Some people may not want an accommodation or need an accommodation, but you might want to be sensitive to the fact that there may be some unsaid request where you can garner some explicit goodwill in being open to the ideas. So an employee is going to make the request, whether implicitly or explicitly. The next step is to inquire about the underlying medical. Now, this is where things get a little tricky. You cannot ask too many questions. What you should be focusing on is what's the medical condition and how does that impact your ability to do the job? Or more specifically and directly, how does your medical condition impact your ability to do the job? You want to collect as little medical information as possible. Now, you may also want to have a conversation, if the employee is open to it, with the medical advisors that the employee has. So it could be their doctor or nurse practitioner. It could be some other medical professional that's giving them advice about their working conditions and working situation. You can have that conversation and have it not be a doctor-patient privilege breaking conversation. You're simply asking the medical professional and the employee, how does your condition affect your ability to do the work? Okay. Any medical information you collect must be kept separate from the rest of the employee's employment records. So it shouldn't end up in their sort of normal day-to-day employee file that anybody can access. It should be contained, it should be kept separate, and it should be kept confidential. If you're putting this information on a computer network, you want to password protect it, okay, and have very few people with access to that password. All right. So once you have that information, now comes the hard part, and now comes the next step of the dialogue, which is how do we collect possible accommodations? And this is where the employer needs to simply be open. All right. You should be open to any idea. It could be as extreme as I need a job transfer to something as simple as, in a COVID world, I'd like to have some shields put up in place so that that's not happening. Or I need to have an air purifier a little bit closer to me and my workspace. All right. It could be I need to work from home. It could be I need to work from home a few days a week. I need time off to go get treatment. Any sort of these accommodations, the employer should just accept them, say thank you, and list them. If you're unclear about what it means, have the dialogue. What does shields mean to you? What does an air purifier mean? What does intermittent time off mean? These are the kinds of questions that you should be asking. What the employer wants to avoid saying is anything of, that's too expensive, we can't do that, that's impossible to do, there's no way we can do that. You want to avoid any kinds of comments along those lines at this stage. Then you collect all of these things, you make sure you're clear on what you're talking about, okay? And then the employer needs to go back and do the next step, which is the analysis. How expensive will this be? What do we have to do? Does it require something simple? Does it require something we have to purchase? Does it require something as radical as completely restructuring the interior of a business? All of those things can go into it, and we're going to talk about what happens after that when we talk about undue burden. But all of that conversation needs to happen before you go back to your employee. All right. So do the assessments of cost, both in terms of money, materials, even impact on your business operations. Okay. Impact on other employees. All of these are relevant factors to consider, and the employer should be considering those. The next step is once you have that, then you go back to your employee and you're discussing things like, okay, what are some of the options that you think are appropriate? Here's what we're having a problem with this. And you continue the dialogue, and maybe you're modifying one or two or three of the accommodations. One accommodation may not be enough, but a combination of accommodations could work quite well. In our next video, we are going to talk about undue burden, which is an important part of the interactive process when it comes to dealing with requests for accommodations. In the meantime, stay safe out there. We'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.